All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely.
Okay, so today we're tackling something pretty intense. It's Russia's use of an ICBM in Ukraine.
Yeah. What really hits home about this is, well, these weapons were designed for nuclear warheads.
Right.
And Russia using conventional ones this time, well, that brings up a lot of questions
Yeah.
about, what are they thinking and what could happen next.
Yeah, for sure. So you sent over a news article, right? It's got the details of what happened and
Mm.
some background on ICBMs and MIRVs.
Yeah, that's right.
And I got to say, before we got into this, I didn't quite realize what a big shift this is. Like, it's a whole new ballgame, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's a big deal. To really get why, we gotta break down what sets ICBMs apart from regular missiles,
Right.
and it all comes down to range. I mean, these things can travel over 5,500 kilometers.
Well, okay, so we're talking like continent to continent kind of range.
Exactly. Launch from one, hit a target on another.
So that's a massive distance. What do we know about this specific attack in Ukraine?
Well, the article says Russia launched this RS-26 Rubezh ICBM
Okay.
from the Astrakhan region. Their target was infrastructure in Dnipro, Ukraine.
And that's, what, over 1,000 kilometers away?
Over 1,000, yeah.
Hold on. So they fired this huge weapon from deep inside Russia
Yeah,
to hit a target way over there in Ukraine.
that's exactly what happened.
Wow.
And there's another layer to this. The article, it talks about them using MIRV technology.
MIRV.
Yeah, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that even mean?
Okay, so imagine you're throwing darts, right? Instead
Okay.
of throwing one dart at the board, you throw a whole handful, each one aimed at a different spot.
Ah, I see. So one missile, but with a bunch of warheads, each one going for a separate target.
You got it.
Man, that makes defense a whole lot harder, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Each warhead, it needs to be targeted individually, intercepted by those anti-ballistic missile systems.
Which are already super complicated as it is.
Yeah.
And the article, it points out that this is the first time we've ever seen MIRV technology used in actual combat.
Yep, first time ever.
Kind of hard to grasp.
Yeah.
Like first time an ICBM is used in war, and first time for MIRVs too. It's a lot to process.
Absolutely. And the implications, they go way beyond this one event. It makes you wonder about the future of warfare, the role of nuclear and conventional weapons. I mean, are those lines even clear anymore? And the risk of things getting out of hand on the world stage.
Okay, so we've established this is a huge EE deal.
Mhm.
But before we jump into, all the global stuff, can we go back to MIRVs for a second?
Mm.
I'm guessing it's not as easy as like just strapping a few bombs onto a missile.
Oh, you're right. It's way more sophisticated than that. An MIRV-equipped missile has this thing called a bus.
A bus.
Yeah. It carries all these warheads, and each one has its own guidance system. Think of it like a school bus dropping kids off at different stops. Except in this case, the kids are warheads, and the stops are enemy targets, sometimes as far as 1,500 kilometers apart.
Okay, that analogy is a bit unsettling, but it gets the point across. And the article mentioned that in this attack on Dnipro, there were at least 6 separate warheads.
At least 6.
That's got to be a total nightmare for any defense system.
Absolutely. It's way harder to stop multiple warheads spread out over a huge area than just dealing with one missile coming in. The stakes are way higher.
Yeah, wow. So we're not just talking about these incredibly powerful, accurate weapons, but now they can hit multiple targets at the same time.
Right.
What does that even mean for the future of warfare?
It's the million-dollar question.
Right.
But before we get into that, there's something else you might find surprising. It adds, well, another layer of complexity to all this.
Oh, okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
So remember how we were talking about the U.S. and the Soviet Union developing MIRVs back in the 70s?
Yeah.
Well, there's a new player in the game now.
Ooh.
India.
Wait, seriously. India has ICBMs with MIRVs.
They do. Earlier this year, they successfully tested their Agni 5 ICBM, and guess what? It's equipped with MIRV technology.
Wow. So you've got Russia actually using this tech in a war, and now India's got their own MIRV-capable ICBMs. It's like a domino effect, isn't it?
It really is. The spread of this advanced weapons technology, it's a growing concern. And this whole situation in Ukraine, it shows us just how serious the consequences could be.
Yeah, no kidding. So with India now having this capability, how does that change things in Asia? What should we be watching out for?
That's a tough question. No easy answers there, but it's definitely something we need to look at more closely. And it brings us back to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
the whole geopolitical landscape and what this ICBM launch in Ukraine really means for the world.
Right, because this goes way beyond just the technology itself.
It does.
It's about how this event is changing the balance of power, the relationships between countries.
Yeah.
I think we're ready to dive into that now.
I agree. Let's shift gears and look at the bigger picture. See how this all fits into the global scene.
All right, everyone, we're going to take a quick break here, but be sure to come back for part 2, where we'll unpack all the geopolitical fallout from this event and what it means for the future of, well, the future of global security.
You won't want to miss it.
All right, so we've established that Russia using an ICBM with MIRV technology in Ukraine, that's a huge deal, both for the conflict itself and for the balance of power globally. You mentioned earlier that this event, it could be a sign of things to come.
Yeah.
Like a new era in warfare.
It's possible.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. This incident, it raises some really serious concerns about deterrence.
Okay.
The lines between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons, they're getting blurrier.
Right.
And the risk of miscalculation in a world that's already, well, pretty volatile. It's definitely increasing.
You mentioned Russia's nuclear doctrine before. Can you remind me how that ties into all of this?
Sure. So basically, Russia now considers any attack on their territory by a non-nuclear state as justification for a nuclear response.
Okay.
But there's a catch.
Oh.
That non-nuclear state has to be receiving support from a nuclear power.
So they're saying if a country like Ukraine, for example, is getting help from, say, the U.S.,
right,
which is a nuclear power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That could potentially lead to a nuclear response from Russia.
Wow.
And don't forget those ATACMS missiles.
The long-range ones the U.S. has been sending to Ukraine.
Yep. Those have the range to hit targets inside Russia.
Yeah. Okay, I see where you're going with this. So Russia could see those missiles as a direct threat to their territory, and then based on their doctrine.
They could justify a nuclear response.
Exactly.
And this recent ICBM launch, even though it was with conventional warheads, it could be seen as a warning shot, just a little reminder of what they're capable of.
Yeah.
And that they're willing to use it.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, look, we have these weapons and we're not afraid to use them, even if it means things could escalate.
Exactly. Of course, some analysts, they say it was more of a show of force, just to, intimidate Ukraine and their allies.
Right.
But no matter what the intention was, the message is pretty clear. Russia's ready to use its military power. And that ICBM launch, it's made a lot of people nervous around the world.
We've talked a lot about what this means for the war in Ukraine. But what about the wider impact, like on the balance of power globally?
Well, this could embolden other countries to try and get similar capabilities.
Oh,
and that could lead to a really dangerous arms race, especially in regions where there's already tension.
Like the Asia-Pacific, for example.
Exactly. You've got China's rise, and India's military is getting stronger.
Right, and we were just talking about India testing their own MIRV-equipped ICBM.
Right.
So could this event in Ukraine make other countries in that region feel like they need to, I don't know, step up their game?
It's definitely possible. This sets a precedent, and not a good one.
Yeah.
If one country shows they're willing to use this type of weapon, even with conventional warheads, it makes other countries think, well, maybe we should too.
So this one event in Ukraine, it could have a ripple effect all over the globe.
Yeah.
Fueling tensions, maybe even starting arms races in other parts of the world.
Absolutely. It really shows how connected global security is. What happens in one place can have a huge impact somewhere else.
So we've got the potential for things to escalate, the nature of warfare is changing, and this is all impacting the global balance of power. What are some key takeaways here? What should we be thinking about as we try to make sense of all this?
I think the first takeaway is how blurred the lines between conventional and nuclear warfare have become. I mean, ICBMs, they used to be solely linked to nuclear weapons. Now they're being used with conventional warheads. That creates a lot of ambiguity and makes the risk of misinterpretation much higher.
It's like the old rules don't apply anymore. Or maybe they're just getting harder to figure out.
Exactly. Which leads us to the second takeaway. Communication and diplomacy are more important now than ever.
Okay.
With these increasingly sophisticated and dangerous weapons, countries need to talk to each other. Clear communication between the major powers that's essential to prevent misunderstandings.
So even if these weapons are here to stay, we have to be extremely careful about how we manage them
Yes.
and how we communicate to avoid any unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And building on that, the third takeaway is that we need to focus on arms control and non-proliferation. If one country develops and uses these weapons, others might feel like they have to do the same.
We definitely don't want a world where these incredibly destructive weapons become more common and easier to get.
Right. It's not just about managing the weapons themselves. It's about preventing the technology and the knowledge to create them from spreading.
Yeah, that sounds like a challenge that requires everyone to work together.
It does. It's a global issue that needs international cooperation and a sense of shared responsibility.
You mentioned before that the global power structure is changing. Can we talk about that a bit more? How does this ICBM launch fit into that bigger picture?
Well, the world is changing, and this event is part of that change, the post-Cold War era, the one with a relatively stable balance of power. That's fading. We're moving into a more multipolar world with new players coming onto the scene. And the old rules, they're being rewritten.
So you're saying the old alliances and power structures, they're not as reliable or predictable as they used to be.
Exactly. China's becoming a global economic and military power. That's changing the existing order. And Russia, well, we've seen that they're trying to reassert their influence, and they're often using military force to do it. And on top of that, you've got other regional powers like India and Brazil. They're becoming more active and influential in international affairs.
Oh, it's not just the U.S. and its allies versus China and Russia anymore. It's a much more complicated situation with more players and a lot more uncertainty.
You got it. We're moving away from a bipolar or unipolar world and toward a multipolar system. Power is more spread out, alliances are harder to predict, and there's a higher potential for conflict, especially as these new power centers compete with each other.
So this ICBM launch in Ukraine, while definitely alarming on its own, it's also a glimpse into this changing world, a world where the rules are still being written and the stakes are incredibly high.
That's a really good observation. What we're seeing is a historical transition. And events like this one, they give us some valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities that are coming our way, even though those insights might be unsettling.
It's a lot to process. It's heavy stuff. But it's incredibly important to understand. But before we go on to talk about potential solutions or paths forward, I think we need to acknowledge the human cost of all of this. We've talked about the technology, the geopolitical shifts, but what about the real people whose lives are being affected by these events?
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the strategic calculations, the talk of deterrence and escalation. But we can never forget that these weapons have the power to cause immense suffering. The conflict in Ukraine has already resulted in so much suffering, and the potential for things to escalate further, especially with weapons like ICBMs, it just amplifies the risks and the potential for devastating consequences.
So as we continue this deep dive, let's keep that human dimension front and center.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we're not just talking about abstract geopolitical concepts. These are issues that have a huge impact on people all over the world. We have a responsibility to approach them thoughtfully and with compassion.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. The technical stuff about ICBMs and MIRVs, the way the global power structure is changing, and the fact that these weapons, they're not just hypothetical anymore. But with all that, we can't forget about the human side of things. What does this all mean for everyday people? How do we even start to think about the ethics of weapons that could literally destroy the planet?
It's a really important point. It's easy to get lost in the strategic details.
Yeah.
But we have to remember these weapons can cause unimaginable suffering. It's a tough subject, but we can't avoid it.
So how do we even approach this? Where do ethics fit into a conversation about weapons that could reshape the Earth?
Well, I think we have to start by acknowledging something. There's this inherent tension between the need for countries to protect themselves and the moral obligation to protect human life.
Right.
It's a classic dilemma. How do we defend ourselves without hurting others? And with weapons like ICBMs, that question gets even more complicated.
Yeah, because the power of these weapons is so immense. Even using them in a limited way could have devastating consequences. It makes you wonder if there's even such a thing as using an ICBM ethically. Is it even morally right to have them at all?
That's a question people have been debating for a long time. There's no simple answer, and there are different views on it. Some people argue that having these weapons, even if you don't use them, acts as a deterrent. It prevents big conflicts from happening. The idea is that the threat of everyone being destroyed keeps everyone in check.
But that argument depends on deterrence actually working, right?
Yeah.
And that these weapons won't be used in a crisis or if someone miscalculates. History's shown us that deterrence can fail. And when we're talking about weapons as powerful, failure isn't an option.
That's the core of the problem. And the opposite view is that ICBMs are inherently wrong. Just because of how powerful they are, it doesn't matter what you plan to do with them. No country should have weapons that can cause that much destruction. And that view is becoming more common, especially as we face these global threats like climate change and pandemics. It makes you ask, should we really be putting money into these weapons when we have other threats that need everyone to work together?
It's a strong argument. It suggests that just having these weapons goes against our responsibility to protect life on Earth. So where do we go from here? What can we as individuals do about this? It feels overwhelming.
I know it can feel that way, but we can't let that feeling stop us. Change starts with individuals. First, we need to educate ourselves and talk about these issues with each other. The more we understand the complexities, the better we'll be at advocating for change.
So we can write to our leaders, participate in public discussions, and talk to our communities about this. But how much impact can individual actions really have on something as big as global nuclear policy?
Don't underestimate collective action. When we join forces with others who share our concerns, our voices become louder and we can push for real change. There are organizations out there working to promote disarmament, prevent nuclear proliferation, and advocate for peaceful ways to resolve conflicts. We can support them with our time, donations, or just by spreading awareness. Every action, no matter how small, helps build a more peaceful and just world.
It's easy to feel powerless when facing such a big challenge. But you're right, change is possible. It starts with us. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to that multipolar world you mentioned. What does this shift in global power mean for the future of arms control and disarmament?
Well, in a multipolar world, those old arms control agreements, the ones that mostly focused on the superpowers talking to each other, those might not be enough anymore. We need new approaches, new ways to work together that involve all the key players, including those rising powers. We need them all talking about global security and responsible management of weapons.
That sounds incredibly difficult, especially in a world where trust is so hard to come by.
It won't be easy, but it's absolutely necessary. We have to build connections, encourage dialogue, and find things we agree on. The alternative is just, well, it's too dangerous to even think about.
So this is a call to action, not just for governments and policymakers, but for everyone.
It is. We all have a role to play in creating a future where these weapons aren't seen as tools for power or deterrence, a future where they're relics of the past, a reminder of the dangers we need to overcome together.
We've certainly covered a lot in this deep dive. It's been a heavy conversation, but I think it's vital that we have these conversations.
I agree. It's not always easy to face these complex and challenging issues, but it's crucial if we want to create a safer and more just world for everyone.
To our listeners, I hope this deep dive has given you some things to think about. Remember, you have a voice. What you do matters. Stay informed, stay engaged, and let's work together to create a future where peace wins. Thanks for joining us.